There's so many things we want to know, especially from such an experienced entrepreneur who's now helping other entrepreneurs in their journey towards setting up their own company.
You just get smarter by the smarter people around you. If I can be the dumbest guy in the room, that's great. If I'm helping somebody that just needs a little bit of help through, me being one or two, experiences ahead of that person, if I can save them time, that's community in action.
Good afternoon, David. Thank you very much for joining us today for this third edition of our podcast. I have Gautam here. You know Gautam for many years, and we are very excited to be in this podcast today as there's so many things we want to know, especially from such an experienced entrepreneur who's now helping other entrepreneurs in their journey towards setting up their own company. So,
well, thanks for having me. Very pleased to join you and hear what questions you've got to do, and at least I'll give you opinions, if not wisdom. How about that?
Yes, sure. Well, thank you. Well, let's get started. I thought we'll start with just early life. Can you share a bit about your upbringing and early life experiences that might have influenced your career path towards choosing to be an entrepreneur?
Yeah, sure. So I live in Australia. I grew up in Sydney, so naturally I played cricket and sort of awoke that geeky engineer side. The thing so naturally happened was I kind of went down that engineering path and thought that's just what I'd do. I thought I'd be a radio engineer, an instrumentation engineer, and then one day I got my hands on an Apple, like a little Apple computer, and found out you could program stuff. And after that, I got stuck in the computer world, and I've remained here today. So certainly sounds a bit odd to be talking about that, but it was a game changer in those days that you could actually be that close to the hardware and do some magical stuff at the time, which was almost like what you want to do as a kid. You want to actually poke something and make it work. And so that's what you do as a product focused engineer. You tend to sort of poke something and try and make it work. There's a few other dimensions to it, which I'm sure we'll come to.
Right. So when you got started with computers, I'm imagining it was nothing like the computers we have today, right? Your inputs and everything. I mean, I remember going with my dad. He's an engineer as well. He's actually a mechanical engineer and a scientist in fracture mechanics. And I used to go with him, and he used to get these slots during the day where he would have these calculations on a card, and he would punch those in, and then those would come out from the other side, and it would take some time. I remember we would get to and the machine was enormous. I mean, it was the size of a big room, and it was all in there, and it was fascinating what he was doing.
Yeah, so I'm old, but I'm not quite that old. So as I mentioned, the first computer I was on was an Apple IIe.
Apple IIe.
Yeah. But my first computer job was doing bench repair of IBCs. So that was 5.25-inch floppies, maybe a 20 meg hard drive, I think, in those days. But the guy who was doing the really hard stuff in my team was working on those washing machine disk drives and the large, the kind of the room size type computers. So I was jealous of that, but little did I know that was going to disappear quickly. And I did actually work on those. I don't know if you remember floppy drives. There was a
I've used floppy drives, not the 7-inch, but I've used the 5-inch ones, the big ones.
Yeah, so the 7-inch ones are kind of crazy because they would go. You want to seek the head to a particular track, and it go and whoa 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 clunk, and they would slam the head down on the thing like an old vinyl record player type thing. Right. So it was pretty retro. They should bring it back, actually.
Yeah, well, I missed the 7-inch one, but yeah, the 5-inch, and then the small ones, which were hard, and you could travel around more easily with those. Yeah.
Yep. So that's dating me, but again, it was kind of like leading from that electrical engineer perspective. It wasn't until a little time later that the software side of it, opened up the possibilities for what you could do with it. But certainly, good grounding in the practical aspects of that, your limitations of the substrate that you're operating on.
Right. And from there to today with AI and things changing so much, and we're having glasses which people are saying might replace our devices and smartphones, and Well, things are changing really rapidly. So I was
Yeah,
wondering
I was just going to make a comment on that. So I read the other day that the electricity consumption for doing one Santa Claus picture with DALI or Mid-Journey is about the same as what you would need to fully charge your phone. So that's like one image. So there's a terrible set of, illusions that are because all these big companies are in an arms race for eyeballs, which I don't believe they will get. They won't necessarily have the loyalty from the consumer. So they're giving that stuff away. They're churning through the venture capital, and people don't actually realise either the impact to the planet or the actual real cost of producing that Santa Claus picture. So it's a pretty shocking sort of state of economics that you're that far away from the hardware. I'm just trying to relate it back to the 7-inch floppy drivers. Like you knew what was going on there and you had a reasonable understanding of the cost of that. But now you can produce garbage that's disposable, but it's actually, really having a cumulative effect on the planet as well too. So sometimes, at some stage we've got to wake up, if not to do with the wastage of investment money, but to do the impacts on the planet as well too. So it's a big deal.
Fascinating, David. I actually did not know. I've been playing around with all these new AI tools. My new LinkedIn posts, I find it fascinating to make new images, using DALI, sometimes using the Microsoft Bing image creator, which I guess uses DALI at the back end. And I'll have to think twice before I do that next time.
It's a good thing to be aware of, I think, just going forward, because sooner or later it's got to be paid for, whether it's paid for.
We are already paying for it as a planet, if that's the amount of energy consumption for one image.
Yeah, you think about a few years ago, the rebellion against Bitcoin, the costs of doing Bitcoin mining. And so there was a whole lot of people that were anti-proof of work computations or currencies. But you really aren't hearing much about that at this particular stage. It's kind of like pushed under the covers a bit. So I imagine the backlash will come on that once enough people wake up to it in some way.
True.
Because it's got to be kind of like there's a whole bunch of things to do with AI safety. Well, safety to the planet as well too.
Yeah. I mean, yes, there's a whole bunch of people. I know Elon Musk has been shouting about it from the rooftop for a while and he feels that the bus left the station in terms of curbing AI and putting in the required regulations for its safety. So
yeah, certainly plenty going on. I don't think we should go there because it'll be out of date by the time this goes live. I think we say we'll be out of date.
That's true. So back to your journey as an entrepreneur, I was wondering if you had any specific role models. You mentioned your dad, but other mentors who played a significant role in shaping your aspirations and who you become as an entrepreneur today.
It's kind of a weird thing. Like my first startup was around about 2000, and in Australia there wasn't much around in terms of entrepreneurial stuff that I was aware of, and I came out of just wanting to make a solution for my customers. So I just kind of went into it naively. So I didn't have any contact with mentors. Google was really just kind of on the rise. We were still using there wasn't a lot of wealth of information. So my mentors were really just around the practicalities of running a business that you could actually make. The mentors for that were, basically people who built traditional businesses. And so you weren't kind of polluted as much in terms of venture economics. You weren't sort of having to compete against blitz scaling type people. So there was a lot more pragmatism about how to build things. And Australia itself has had that for quite some time, which is why Australia tends to do pretty well with B2B SaaS, but they don't do so well in regards to consumer, B2C. So, all the big businesses for consumer, typically get built out of the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, because you require that deep funding to do that, whereas that didn't happen in Australia. So I would say the mentors I had, so like one aspect to do with, like a mentor that I had was literally, we were 6 months of cash left. I was, freaking out, literally sort of having sort of a minor breakdown around that because I didn't know how to frame it. And this mentor just helped me frame it in terms of what's the worst case scenario. So looking at what was the next 2 steps you could do to actually mitigate against that risk, and so on and so forth. So that's an example about the mentoring was just very good, practical, common sense type mentoring, as opposed to kind of a lot of startup stuff to do with product market fit or spend more on acquisition, all those sorts of things. So yeah, So mentors were really just good business people in the true sense of the word.
Right.
So, David, when I started working with you at Points, now it's rebranded to Contextual, and I was always wondering, it was obviously a unique idea, and it made the job of developer very easy, and also for the founder. So, what gave you the idea to build a Points and Contextual?
So we had to pivot out of what we were doing. We started off in the mobile. We were in that space, and we had a product offering in market, and we had customers, and we'd seen that Google had bought a company called Firebase, and we didn't think, like, you look at when one of these big companies buys something, quite often the technology just gets shelved. And so we were kind of thinking that, we could go on as a business in terms of this particular sub market of push notifications, and we were wrong. I was out there pitching for this particular company and product at the time, and I happened to meet up with some guys down in Mountain View who were investors, and they said, no, Firebase is going to be big, and they explained why, which was basically, Apple and Google had to, basically fight it out for the hearts. And so we said, okay, well, and I quite often think of pivots, so people talk about pivoting a lot, and, they sort of think, oh, well, we'll go from this idea, and, if I take a famous one that's worked, I think Slack previously, I think they were being funded for a game or something like that. And then they pivoted into being, a messaging system for corporates. Okay, that worked out. I wouldn't call that a pivot in the sense, because a pivot usually physically, if you think of it from a mathematics or a geometrical thing, it's literally that you actually hold a fixed point. And the logic, that logic relates to a game that we had in Australia, which was called Twister, which is where I don't know whether you've seen it, so you have a bunch of people and they all stand on a dot, and then you spin the thing and you've got to go to the red dot, and you all end out twisted around each other. And so that's the way I think of pivoting, that you basically have one of your feet firmly on the ground, and that is the basis of your organization's DNA, right? So that you then say, okay, well, how can I translate our DNA and our skills to something else? So we kept our foot planted in terms of mobile, and we were working with what you might call a MarTech solution or a marketing technology solution. And we said, okay, well, we can't compete against Google in that situation, but we can go up the stack. And so Contextual, as it is today, or as Gautam said, Pointsy it was then, which is we wanted to point users to the right thing inside the application to increase engagement, to increase what you call activation. So if people are aware of the pirate metrics, which is acquisition, activation, retention, referral, and revenue. So AARR, which is the pirate metrics. So we had decided originally, that first company, we were in the sort of, the retention space. And so we just stayed in the retention space, but providing more value in-app for product teams to be able to engage users with in-app content. So it wasn't much of a leap of faith. All it was really, instead of a leaping into something new, it was just a leap up the stack to provide more value inside. And what was happening, this is now called a sector, which is about a $15 billion sector called product adoption, digital adoption, product adoption. And so there were other companies that were doing that in web, and we did mobile first as a bit of a uniqueness, and added web in later on. But a lot of people delivered, companies such as Pendo, for example, they delivered a solution up front to do that for B2B SaaS type applications. So, I believe we're still the strongest, even without the release that we've got coming this month, where we do something quite unique. We're still the strongest at like this product adoption sector, because, if software's eating the world, then usually it's apps that are the enablement for that. I guess there's some new questions around that, if I'm perfectly candid, that we don't know what AI will do. Does every single app in the world collapse into being, a chat interface? We can go right into that if you like, but it's just like, it's a question we've got, what is the impact on apps and chat as an interface in comparison to mobile? So will a lot of companies ultimately convert across to just being chat enabled? Anyway, so we still know there's millions of apps out there that have product market fit, that require activation and retention for their users. So we provide value for that. in both mobile and web.
That's a fascinating discussion. Maybe we'll have it a little later, especially with the release of Humanly. Where the two Apple guys, ex-Apple guys, have released the AI-based product, which doesn't have a phone. But
I know that, so I'll be interested to hear about it.
yeah, it's a device which replaces the phone it's just got a camera and you speak to it through audio, and it also, if you need to read something, you can read it on your palm. So it sends out it's an interesting device. I don't think it's the one that's going to replace a smartphone, but it's an interesting one for someone who doesn't want to use the smartphone all the time. It could be in a small device that you carry around. But before that, I thought when we are talking about contextual, Gautam and I were talking about this, and you did a rebranding, right? I just wanted to pick your brain on that. What led to it, and what's been your experience?
It's a classic problem for startups in the sense that, what do you want to be when you grow up? Well, sometimes you get it right from the start. So even with ThreatMetrics, my last company, ThreatMetrics, we started out as Spam Matters, right? And that was because we were doing forensic identification of spam, and Matters was the legal component of it, that they talk about legal matters. And so in that particular case, we couldn't monetize that first business to the degree that we wanted to scale, and so we pivoted using exactly the same technology to solve a slightly different problem, and we pivoted into ThreatMetrics. And so ThreatMetrics was a brand change as well too. But in the case of Pointsy versus Contextual, was that we thought Pointsy was a really nice thing because it was pointing users to the right part of the application to activate them. But I didn't know about a thing called Ponzi. So rowing upstream, you're trying to reset people's expectations the whole time, particularly as you into the US market. You were having this issue to do with the associations with that. And actually, funnily enough, the ThreatMetrics had the same problem. Even today, Americans say to me threat matrix because there was a TV program called, for some reason that survived that particular thing, but point a negative connotation. And all I can say is just, if you're lucky enough to nail the right brand name right up front, then all power to you. That's fantastic, because the rebrand is way more painful and time consuming that we're still shaking off certain things at the API level, you get inside the SDKs and we're still getting things out there. Now, sure, Elon Musk can kind of do it overnight, but maybe if you look under the hood of some API, it's still got some old branding in there. And, it takes a lot of time and effort to actually, and cost to move across. So maybe that's a startup business in itself, something that's much more sort of elastic around naming. I don't know. It's more than just a DNS change.
Right. It's fascinating. So I think since Gautam and you've worked together, and we were curious about your relationship in terms of outsourcing. I mean, there's some benefits, but then it's in a totally different location, and versus having somebody right next to you. And especially in this new world where there's a lot of work from home. So even if you're working in the same city, people are working more and more from home and so on. So I wanted to understand from your perspective, what do you find going forwards, the outsourcing world? What are the challenges you see there, and possibly benefits?
Yeah, so that company, so we were an email filtering company. Surf Control was a web filtering company. We had a really valuable product, right place, right time. And so what we had was we had different territories wanting, have this product. So Japan, we had a customer in Japan that wanted a complete translation of the product. And we had the subject matter experts in Australia. I had a Japanese person on my team, and by that stage we'd been acquired by a UK company who had existing outsourcing arrangements or some sort of deal they needed to fulfill. So they outsourced that through India, but project managed through England. And so therefore you had 4 time zones. You had Sydney with the experts, you had Tokyo as the customer, you had the UK on GMT, and then you had India. So it turned up a year late, whereas really it was a 60-day project if we'd have just used the Japanese skill set that we actually had in our own time zone. So I think that particularly with work from home, over the years, I've always struggled to get past what I call the mañana syndrome, which is, we'll just leave that for tomorrow. So mañana is like, it's too hard and so is not available in this thing right now. And so therefore it just blows across. And when you blow something across to tomorrow, then tomorrow you'll blow it across to the day after. And that's how you get a 1 year late type perspective. So I think from an outsourcing perspective, anybody who understands that that's a pivotal aspect of delivery and an obligation on them is a really key thing. The way I divvy things up is I kind of like the core of the product is always built by the internal team, and the internal team can be anywhere. And anywhere these days, I've been intrigued by how Silicon Valley responds to work from home and stuff like that, because they were very kind of like very Bay Area centric, that you needed to show up, that you needed to be in the office, etc. And you can kind of do that if you're one of the really hip, you've got a chef type company. But then all that changed even for them, and so you get a situation where Elon Musk sounds like he's kind of outdated, and that people have to actually show up to the office, because the culture had changed. Yes. And that was at the car company, but I think when he took over Twitter, the culture, the prevailing culture there was mostly work from home, even though probably most of the people lived in the Bay Area still at that stage, just by the nature of the demographic. But anyway, so I've always kind of said, okay, well, things that are non-core intellectual property are candidates for offshoring or outsourcing, and that would be different. I think every company has to be different. That's just my personal bias on that, because it allows the conversations to be, whether it's investors or whether it's acquirer due diligence, it allows the conversations to be much simpler in regards to intellectual property, confidentiality, staff retention, all those sorts of things. So that's my take on it. So in regards to time zones, we're pretty happy at the moment. We are outsourcing at the moment to Vietnam, and we do have DevOps outsourced to India as well too. And so that's where we make that work. And I kind of find that that's because we get enough time zone overlap with Vietnam. We are able to solve problems in one business day that would normally mañana across. So that's just my take on that.
Great. I can see Gautam wants to ask a few questions.
Yeah. So since apart from the Contextual, you had another companies, and I assume that was a parent of the. Yeah. How did that start?
So yes, is the company, and Contextual is the product. So nothing much has changed there, except that very early push notification, the geo-fenced. You can probably hear it in the name, Street Hawk. It was literally around the push notification. So we've had 2 name pivots through the process.
Right.
Done that twice. Yeah. So but Street Hawk is the actual company itself.
Yeah, I remember when I was working Stephen, and we were doing some testing regarding geofencing. So one feature there, for that I had to install the app and go on the road to test the geofencing feature, and it was really interesting.
Yeah, it's the mobile just brings up. So one piece of advice for anybody is if you can actually build your solution on web technologies, think about it, because that's like mobile just introduces so many peripheral things that are kind of interesting. So I'm kind of monitoring, what's happening with, progressive web apps, PWAs and so on, just to kind of always understand you've got really strong signals coming from, Apple with Swift, and then you've got Google over here with Flutter and Dart. And if you saw the recent Gemini announcement, they showed the AI generating the code for the app in Flutter, and that was generating a web app in Flutter, but obviously because it's Flutter, it would work on mobile as well too. So so mobile always, there's a whole lot of complexities. You're going to do it in a hybrid platform like React Native, some sort of web JavaScript framework, using tools like Ionic or something like that, Capacitor. So you've got all of those complexities, which ultimately sort of affect your build pipelines, your QA complexity, things like that. So if ultimately, if you are building a product to an MVP stage, or you're trying to find product market fit, and you can achieve that with web technologies, that's probably a good thing to do, because you'll spend less time looking at that. If you're going to pick something where it's something kind of like geographically based, then we're maybe too hamstrung to do that. So yeah, there's a few small things like that. Obviously, if you're doing games or you're doing something that actually requires instrumentation, whether it's AR or VR or something like that, then obviously you do need to do mobile. But if it's some sort of like SaaS product in your pocket, some sort of form-based type thing, whether it's job scheduling or whatever, maybe that's probably achievable with web. I think even Slack, I could be wrong here, but basically the Slack desktop application is a web technology, etc. The framework escapes me right. Meteor? No. Anyway, yeah. So even really large companies have made that decision, and I'm sure being prudent about those decisions early on can be really helpful to your velocity. And velocity is everything for startups, right?
Yes. Yep. Let's now go to the next segment. We already got to know about your journey, and I remember last time we spoke that you are a board member of Fishburne. So how did that started?
By being a customer, by being a tenant. So I was sharing an office with the guys who actually started it. So it was across the Sydney CBD, about half a kilometre, and they said, Dave, come on down. And I said, I don't want to be a landlord. Couldn't think of anything worse. And because of that in the early days, but what their vision was to create a community of people who are actually in the early stages of startups. And to this day, on the board of Fishburners, I don't get paid. It's a volunteer position because I believe in supporting the startup community. And so, but to this day, the differentiation between this and every other co-working space, around the city, including the WeWorks of the world, is to do with community, to not being a bums on seats place. And so, if you talk to anybody that's a current tenant of WeWork, that's a beautiful premises, great view out the thing. We've got an office to ourselves, but we never have any serendipitous water cooler conversations or kitchen conversations. Whereas, I've just been up to just get a glass of water from the kitchen, and you have a quick conversation with somebody, and again, you just learn something. Like just yesterday, I had a conversation with somebody who's working on AI movies, animation, and some of it, just pointed me at some of the latest stuff in that, and you go, oh wow, I need to keep an eye on this, because that's so that doesn't necessarily help my business, but you just get smarter by the smarter people around you. If I can be the dumbest guy in the room, that's great. If I'm helping somebody that just needs a little bit of help through me being one or two, experiences ahead of that person, if I can save them time, that's community in action. So of course, with the work from home type thing, a lot of people, you're sort of ships in the night. You may not be in every day of the week, so you don't get that. But still, if you've got, tools like Slack, then the community conversation can continue. If you're in for Friday night pitch night and Friday night drinks, they're amazing events that still give you that serendipitous conversation. But the number one key difference is that Fishburners has always been able to be, a community rather than just a place for getting a desk and getting Wi-Fi. That's your baseline type stuff.
Right. David, I'm conscious of time. We're just about 5-6 minutes over. We're going to edit this out, but wanted to check how long we have, and depending on that, we could address a few more questions.
So I'm good to 15 past. Oh, sorry, That'll be 15-2 for you.
Right. Cool. So given that and I looked through, we were reading your LinkedIn profile together, and you've always been customer focused, and that's been the key towards your entrepreneurial journey. So I was wondering if there were any lessons you wished you had learned earlier.
I guess probably also too that the lessons that you might have learned in 2018 may not even be viable 2023. So I'm not quite sure. I think it's, again, that I mentioned upfront about the mentor, the mentor aspect, managing downside risk. I think some things are perennial, which is that if you take that as an example, so if you can kind of figure out what the worst case scenario in terms of managing downside risk is, you can actually eliminate a lot of tax from your thinking. Now, obviously, the easiest way to eliminate downside risk is go and raise a truckload of money, right? And then hopefully that gives you runway through the tough times. But it's really just kicking the can down the road. I have my own view on venture and stuff like that, which I'll come back to in a second. But the key thing is that you need mental clarity. You need enough downtime. You need to be not operating too much from fear and, you know, the catastrophe and stuff like that. So yeah, so I think that's kind of like one of the things. So there's lessons that are perennial, and that is, you know, if you can manage the downside risks to the point where it's not interfering with your thought processes and your sleep and things like that. And, you know, things like sleep and so on are still something I struggle with. And I guess that would be sort of like, you know, if people see they're going down that path, then that's probably one of the number one things they need to fix personally as well too. You know, there's a bunch of that. I would say that also, just generally speaking, see, I come from a time when there wasn't a lot of venture. So I think it's, you know, now people go and raise money before they've actually, you know, really sort of got customer one, right? So, you know, that zero to one type thing. And I'm not saying that raising off a piece of paper is a bad thing. I think if you know your area and you are proven in that area and you actually know the itch that's waiting to be scratched in that, and you know the size of the market, then you can probably raise off paper or a PowerPoint presentation just in that. But a lot of other times, probably what you want to do is have enough signals around product market fit, or enough proof that your go-to-market strategy is going to be a winning strategy, and then you may try and raise, you know, institutional funding or even angel funding at that particular stage. So you're funding into something that's actually working. Whereas if you're funding into research and your research is not deep tech, like it's just you know, it's just an app, then it's probably going to be challenging later on if you don't get the traction that you've hoped for. That's kind of one thing. I think also, you know, it's always about people. I mean, it's really always about people. So the first few hires, those sorts of things. Yeah, don't run dry in terms of your runway. Again, that's kind of like the sleep type thing. I think also too, what we're still struggling with is the change of social media environments. Like, in terms of what's your acquisition strategy, who's, you know, are you targeting a customer persona that actually has budget, those sorts of things. So, you know, you've got to actually be pragmatic and say, okay, well, and I'll give you an example. So in our particular area, you know, the industry would say the product manager is the CEO of the product. And we said, you know, great, the product manager is the CEO of the product. That means they're in control. Yeah, well, no. So product managers still, they may have that in Silicon Valley, but so often it's still either sales or both have still actually hold the purchasing decisions. And I guess that's kind of like, I don't know, it was about 6 months ago, there was kind of like a wave against product managers, that a lot of large companies basically shed a layer of product management, which is probably right, but it also shows how an organization views product managers. So, yeah, guess what? You didn't end up being the CEO of the product after all. So, yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, it's only a general rule. I mean, certainly there are anybody who's trying to build a very sort of a product-led growth type business, and, you know, particularly you've got the funding to do that, then it seems as though product managers do have more clout. But I would say just align your potential your target customer persona with somebody who actually has budgetary control. So that's another one. I can kind of answer different opinions if you want to throw something at me, my thoughts on something, but that's just a couple off the top of my head.
Gautam, do you want to add something?
No.
Okay. So I think this would be a good opportunity to go back to that one question we were dealing with, which was the how do you look at the future of apps, right? We thought we'll come back to that for a short while. So it would be good to listen to your viewpoints. You are in the midst of it, and you're looking at all this AI and the influence of AI. And where do you see this going? I was talking to the CTO of our company. We had a get together, and he was saying it's very interesting. There is a possibility that we would have kind of something like what we have in China, like a mother app, but, you know, as a chat interface. So your AI stores all your data. It knows everything about you, which today, because of privacy laws, most of the apps can't hold as much data. So it knows exactly what you like to eat, which time you like to fly. So when you book, he was giving the example of booking a flight. If you go through an app, you still need to feed in all these data every time, that I would prefer this kind of breakfast. The apps seem not to have been able to do that great a job of saying, okay, this guy loves only vegetarian food but not spicy. It still throws up the 10 options and I need to go and choose that. I would prefer an AI doing that for me. And that might be where we are heading in the next 3-4 years or 2-3 years. Thoughts?
So I kind of would add another thing to that, which is, you know, like what's the apocalyptic aspect of that in regards to people who make apps today, or people who are, you know, mobile is a very powerful platform for people today. The preferred environment that a customer likes to interact with you. It's, you know, the going back to my desktop and something like that is generationally sort of like diminishing. And so therefore these things work. The question is whether it needs to be an app interface on that. So I think the first kind of thing is like, well, I think if I go 500 meters that way, there's a big tower that belongs to a company called IBM, right? Nobody needs to go to work, and those organizations still make money because their customers are at the top end of the echelon of customers. So I think probably not much will change in terms of innovation at those levels. Like the customers will move fairly slowly and stuff like that. Where you'll see, I mean, obviously AI. You know, if you saw Benioff making offers to anybody from OpenAI a few weeks ago, when the whole Sam Altman thing happened, you know, an innovation that has a bit of a mix around the personalization and a little bit about sort of like spontaneity in regards to, you know, whatever problem I've got today, you know, will be different to what was yesterday. But I want to pick up the thread of conversation I had 2 days ago, because, you know, that's a multi-day or a multi-week project or something like that. So that's kind of interesting. I think we're pretty well exploring the opportunities in that space as well too. I think also too, the ideas around privacy and safety are really kind of interesting in the sense that, you know, Google's sort of saying, well, you'll be able to run a model that's private, as opposed, you know, those moving towards those sorts of things. So that's new. It's a refinement on what we saw with ChatGPT earlier on in the year. We'll see a lot around that. Yeah. So commoditization of public data is going. You know, I'd be very careful with people who are contemplating a startup idea that's actually just layering on AI on the top of public data. I don't think that's a good place to be. That sort of stuff. Lots of money being invested in terms of personal assistance, like what you said, not necessarily the hardware one you mentioned, but just, you know, the fact that the personal assistant knows pretty much most of my life. It has access to my calendar. It reads my emails. You know, that's definitely going to be, there's going to be a couple of solutions come out in that. And the question is as well, how does somebody who's selling insurance compete against that? Will you ultimately, as an insurance provider, sell to have like product placement for the home thing? So, you know, this whole disruption about people never going to Google again. Well, the same is, well, where's my marketing spend going as well too? So, you know, it'll be interesting to see the evolution around that. Like, how do you actually get your product recommended through a chatbot, which is personally, you know, is personalized to the user, not to the vendor? So that's an
interesting challenge. A lot of ethical challenges as well coming up, I'm guessing.
Yeah, well, you know, several years ago, I guess it must be 2013, there was a financial product. I think they were called Mint, and Mint allowed you to have, you know, sort of advice around how to spend, you know, how to do your budgeting and stuff like that. But so you got product recommendations, you know, through that, and that was through the partnership. So it is a business model, you know, that kind of works inside a SaaS thing, and I guess it's like a product placement type thing, or a featured product in the search results or the help. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's one of the you know, there's a couple of billion probably being invested into that now. So
well, David, it's a fascinating conversation, and I think we could go on endlessly. But thank you so much for taking the time today and
great, guys.
You know, answering some of our questions. We learned a lot, Gautam and I. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really enjoyed spending the time with you, and wish you well with the podcast.
Yeah, sure. And I believe that this conversation will motivate other young startups, entrepreneurs also.
Yeah, by all means, you know, just reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter on DJ and Oz. I don't go into Twitter as much these days, don't tell Elon. But one of those things that sometimes it's like watching the news. You go in there and you just end out sadder. So anyway, DJ and Oz, and the same on LinkedIn as well too, DJ and Oz. David Jones is pretty common. Okay. So anyway.
Thank you. I will connect on Twitter as well.
Yeah. Thanks, chaps. Have a great afternoon.
You too. Bye-bye.